The night air over Leyte Gulf was heavy with mist and tension. It was October 19, 1944, and the U.S. Navy prepared for one of the most important operations of the Pacific War. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was about to begin. The goal was clear. American forces would land troops on Leyte Island to start liberating the Philippines from Japanese control. But first, the coastal defenses had to be destroyed. Looming in the dark waters were some of the most powerful warships ever built. Among them were the USS Iowa, USS New Jersey, and USS Wisconsin. Each carried 9 16-inch guns, massive weapons housed in 3 turrets. These guns were the pride of the American fleet. Each shell weighed 2,700 pounds, heavier than a small car. When fired, a single shell could travel over 20 miles and smash through thick steel or concrete. As dawn broke, the sea remained calm, but the silence was deceptive. The ship's crews worked quickly, loading powder bags and shells into the giant breeches of the guns. Orders came down the line. Spotters confirmed targets on the Japanese-held shore. Bunkers, artillery positions, and troop concentrations were marked for destruction. At first light, the order was given to fire. The first salvo from the Iowa's forward turret erupted with a deafening roar. The blast shook the ship and sent shockwaves across the water. A moment later, the shells landed on the coast, throwing up huge plumes of earth and smoke. Within seconds, the New Jersey and Wisconsin joined in. Soon, the entire line of battleships fired in a steady rhythm. The effect on shore was devastating. Japanese soldiers who had been awake through the night were caught by surprise. Many had never experienced this level of naval bombardment. At first, they mistook the distant flashes for lightning. Then came the sound, a rolling thunder that grew louder and louder until it was unbearable. Bunkers that had been dug deep into the earth collapsed under direct hits. Defensive trenches vanished as if swept away by a storm. Palm trees and jungle foliage were stripped bare, leaving only blackened craters. Whole sections of the beach seemed to disappear. Japanese commanders tried to maintain control. Radios crackled with frantic messages. Spotters reported that the American guns were reaching far beyond the beaches, striking command posts and supply depots deep inland. One officer described it as an earthquake mixed with a typhoon. The psychological impact was as great as the physical destruction. Soldiers began to panic. Some deserted their positions, while others froze, unable to act. From the American ships, the view was different but equally intense. Sailors watched through binoculars as shells exploded on target. They could see the coastline tearing apart. The power of their guns was awe-inspiring, even to the men who operated them. But there was no celebration. They knew that the destruction meant lives lost. Their focus was on supporting the troops who would soon land on those same beaches. The process was precise. Forward observers in aircraft and on submarines sent back coordinates. The battleships adjusted their fire to ensure that no area of Japanese resistance was left intact. Communication was constant. Each turret crew worked like a machine, loading and firing without pause. Powder bags were stacked neatly. Shells were moved into position with cranes and rammers. Every step was timed and measured. On land, Japanese resistance crumbled hour by hour. Key artillery positions that could have threatened American landing craft were silenced. Ammunition stores exploded under direct hits. In one area, a complete regiment was trapped when the shoreline behind them collapsed under the bombardment, cutting off escape. By the end of the day, the coastline was unrecognizable. What had been fortified positions were now smoking ruins. The water near the beaches was filled with debris, some of it from destroyed ships and landing craft caught in the barrage. The scale of the operation was unlike anything seen before in the Pacific. As darkness fell, the battleships pulled back slightly to prepare for the next day's operations. Crews were exhausted but remained ready. The Japanese defenders, however, were broken. They had faced heavy naval guns before, but never on this scale. Many believed that the Americans had brought some new, secret weapon to the battle. The truth was simpler. It was the raw power of the 16-inch naval gun, used with precision and overwhelming force. The next morning, October 20th, The shelling resumed briefly before the first wave of American troops began their landing. Marines and Army soldiers rode in small landing craft, watching as massive plumes of smoke rose from the shore. Some felt relief knowing the enemy had been pounded so thoroughly. Others felt dread at the thought of walking through the ruins. As the landing craft approached the beaches, the battleships shifted their fire inland to cover advancing troops. The coordination between sea and land forces was exact. Radios linked the ships and the troops, ensuring that the bombardment stayed ahead of the advance. On shore, Japanese survivors emerged from wrecked bunkers and shattered forests. Some tried to fight, but their weapons and supplies were gone. Others surrendered or fled into the jungle. The few organized counterattacks were quickly crushed. The destruction caused by the 16-inch guns left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. For the Americans, it showed the value of their battleships and the effectiveness of their planning. For the Japanese, it was a moment of shock and realization. Their coastal defenses, built over months and years, had been erased in a single day. The waters of Leyte Gulf were now firmly under American control. The stage was set for one of the largest naval battles in history. The thunder of the 16-inch guns still echoed across the bay as night fell once again, marking the beginning of the next phase of the Pacific War. The 16-inch naval gun was the most powerful weapon carried by the battleships of the United States Navy during World War II. It was a product of years of engineering and the demands of a global war fought across oceans. These guns were built to destroy enemy ships, fortifications, and anything else that stood in the way of an advancing fleet. When seen up close, they were massive pieces of machinery, stretching more than 60 feet from breech to muzzle. Each barrel was a piece of forged steel that had been machined to precise tolerances. The caliber of the gun was 16 inches, or 406 millimeters. That measurement referred to the diameter of the shell it fired. A single shell weighed 2,700 pounds, more than many small cars. There were different types of shells, including armor-piercing rounds for sinking ships and high-explosive rounds for use against fortifications and shore targets. Loading these shells was a complex and dangerous task. They were hoisted from deep inside the ship's magazines using heavy-duty hoists and cranes. Powder bags, each weighing over 100 pounds, were brought up separately. A full charge required several bags, packed carefully into the breech behind the shell. The range of the gun was between 20 and 24 miles, depending on the type of shell and the charge used. This allowed a battleship to strike targets far inland without ever coming close to the shore. The range was so great that spotters in aircraft or on submarines were often used to direct the fire. These observers relayed coordinates back to the ship, where fire control teams calculated angles and distances using mechanical computers. Each battleship carried 9 of these guns, arranged in 3 turrets. Each turret had 3 barrels that could be aimed and fired together or independently. The turrets themselves were armored fortresses, with walls of steel many inches thick. Beneath the turret, deep inside the ship, were the magazines and handling rooms where shells and powder were stored. This design kept the dangerous explosives safe and protected from enemy fire. The guns could fire 2 rounds per minute per barrel. That meant a single battleship could send 18 shells flying toward the enemy every 60 seconds. The combined weight of these shells was staggering, nearly 50,000 pounds of steel and explosives every minute. When several battleships fired together, the volume of fire was overwhelming. The destructive power of the 16-inch gun was unmatched. An armor-piercing shell could penetrate 19 inches of steel armor, enough to punch through the heaviest battleship plating of the era. High-explosive shells were equally fearsome, capable of cratering shorelines and demolishing concrete bunkers. When used against land targets, the impact was similar to heavy bombing raids. Entire defensive networks could be destroyed in a matter of hours. The shock effect was as important as the physical destruction. The blast wave from a single shell could kill or injure soldiers even if they were not directly hit. The sound carried for miles. When fired, the guns produced a deep, rolling thunder that could be felt through the deck plates of the ship. Sailors described the sensation as standing inside a giant drum. Japan's navy also had powerful battleships. The most famous was the Yamato, which carried 18.1-inch guns. These were even larger than the American 16-inch guns, and they fired shells weighing over 3,000 pounds. However, the Yamato-class ships were few in number, and they were rarely used for shore bombardment. Their guns were designed mainly for ship-to-ship combat. This gave the U.S. Navy an advantage when supporting amphibious operations. The American battleships could deliver sustained bombardment against land targets, clearing the way for troops to land. The technology behind these guns was advanced for its time. Fire control was handled by teams of specialists using analog computers and optical rangefinders. They worked in coordination with radar systems that could track targets even at night or in poor weather. Adjustments were made constantly to account for wind, distance, and the movement of both the ship and the target. Maintenance was constant. The barrels wore out after hundreds of rounds and had to be replaced. Crews inspected the breeches and loading mechanisms after every firing to ensure safety. Misfires or accidents could be deadly. Everyone involved in operating the guns was highly trained, from the loaders deep below decks to the officers in the fire control tower. When a battleship went into action, the process of firing the guns was like a carefully choreographed dance. Orders were given through a network of phones and voice tubes. Shells and powder were lifted to the turret. Loaders rammed the charge home, and the breech was sealed. The turret rotated to face the target while the guns elevated to the correct angle. At the command to fire, the guns discharged almost simultaneously. The recoil pushed each barrel back several feet before hydraulic systems returned it to position. Smoke and blast pressure swept across the deck. On shore, the effect was catastrophic. Concrete structures cracked and collapsed. Steel was twisted and bent. Trenches filled with earth and debris. Trees and vegetation were flattened. Defenders often could not even see where the fire was coming from, as the ships were far beyond the horizon. During bombardments, the battleships worked closely with other elements of the fleet. Cruisers and destroyers provided additional fire, while aircraft from carriers spotted targets and reported damage. The coordination required discipline and precision. Mistakes could lead to shells falling on friendly forces, so every step was checked and confirmed. The 16-inch naval gun was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of industrial strength and military planning. Its presence on the battlefield allowed the United States to project power across vast distances. In the Pacific, where islands were often heavily fortified, the ability to deliver massive, accurate fire before a landing was critical. These guns gave American forces a tool that no other navy could match in both quantity and effectiveness. When the guns of the Iowa, New Jersey, and Wisconsin opened fire, they demonstrated what modern naval warfare had become. No longer was the battleship limited to fighting other ships at close range. With these weapons, a fleet could reach deep inland, shaping battles before a single soldier stepped ashore. The 16-inch gun defined the character of amphibious operations and showed the destructive reach of naval power at its peak. The shoreline of Leyte lay quiet in the early morning darkness. Japanese forces waited behind their defenses, confident they could repel an American landing. They had spent months building bunkers, laying barbed wire, and positioning artillery. Machine gun nests covered the beaches. Anti-ship guns were hidden in camouflaged positions, ready to open fire as soon as American landing craft appeared. The defenders believed they understood how a naval bombardment would unfold. They expected scattered shelling, brief and inaccurate, before the Americans pushed in. Out beyond the horizon, American battleships gathered information. The Iowa, New Jersey, and Wisconsin stood at the center, their silhouettes sharp against the first light of dawn. Around them, cruisers and destroyers formed a protective screen. Orders moved across the fleet by signal lamp and radio. The plan was methodical. The battleships would move into position and unleash their full firepower before the landing craft advanced. Every target had been mapped out by scouts and reconnaissance aircraft. At 0600 hours, the command to open fire was given. The forward turrets of the Iowa turned toward the shore. 3 massive barrels elevated, their dark muzzles lined up on coordinates transmitted from a spotting plane circling overhead. A deep mechanical hum filled the turret as the guns locked into position. The first salvo roared to life, sending three 2,700-pound shells arching high into the sky. Seconds later, the shells struck the shoreline. The explosions ripped through the still morning air. Plumes of dirt, smoke, and shattered concrete shot hundreds of feet into the sky. The sound rolled back across the water like continuous thunder. The New Jersey and Wisconsin fired almost immediately after, their own salvos joining the attack. The Japanese defenders were caught off guard. Many had been in their bunkers through the night, waiting for signs of an amphibious assault. They thought the first explosions were distant artillery or even a natural event. Then more shells landed, and the ground began to shake beneath them. Trenches collapsed in on themselves. Palms and jungle foliage were stripped away, leaving bare earth where there had once been cover. The bombardment intensified as the battleships found their rhythm. Each turret fired in sequence, creating a steady pattern of destruction. The shore seemed to erupt continuously. Bunkers were smashed to rubble. Guns were flipped from their mounts and hurled aside. Ammunition caches exploded, sending secondary blasts across the battlefield. In some places, entire units were erased before they could react. Japanese observation posts struggled to keep track of the situation. Spotters used field glasses and radios, shouting updates to command centers already overwhelmed with information. Smoke from burning trees and shattered buildings blocked their view. They could not pinpoint the American ships because they lay far beyond the visible horizon. The shells seemed to come from nowhere, as if the sea itself had turned against them. In one underground command bunker, officers shouted orders and tried to coordinate a defense. Radios crackled with frantic reports from scattered units. Some messages cut off mid-sentence, silenced by direct hits. The senior commander tried to keep order, demanding that artillery batteries return fire, but few guns were left intact. The few that did fire were silenced within minutes as American shells landed with pinpoint accuracy. The key moment came when the Iowa received updated coordinates for the main Japanese command post. The information came from a spotting aircraft that had identified signs of heavy radio traffic near a cluster of camouflaged buildings inland. The Iowa's forward turret adjusted slightly. The gunnery officer confirmed the range and angle. The order to fire came down the line. 3 shells left the barrels in a thunderous blast. They traveled in a high arc, disappearing into the clouds before crashing into the target area. The first shell struck the roof of the bunker, punching through several feet of reinforced concrete before detonating inside. The second landed just outside, collapsing the entrance and burying those who tried to escape. The third struck nearby, cutting off the last surviving communications cables. Inside, the Japanese officers never had a chance. The explosion tore through the room, ending all organized defense in that sector. Radios went silent across the shoreline. Units that were still fighting suddenly had no orders. Confusion spread. Some commanders tried to act on their own, but with no coordination, their efforts failed. Back at sea, the American gunnery crews did not pause. They shifted fire to secondary targets, maintaining a relentless pace. Forward observers in aircraft directed salvos deeper inland, striking roads, bridges, and supply points. Destroyers moved closer to the shore, their smaller guns raking the beaches and treelines. On the ground, Japanese soldiers fought to survive. Many tried to dig deeper, clawing at the earth as the bombardment rained down. Others abandoned their positions and fled into the jungle. Entire companies disappeared without a trace, swallowed by fire and smoke. The few counter-battery guns that managed to fire were quickly destroyed by return fire from the battleships. American landing craft waited several miles out to sea, their decks crowded with Marines and Army soldiers. From that distance, the men could see the coastline erupting under the bombardment. Giant columns of smoke rose into the sky. Some soldiers felt relief, knowing the enemy was being softened before they had to step ashore. Others felt a growing unease, wondering what would be left when they arrived. By mid-morning, the shoreline was a wasteland. Blackened craters marked the former locations of defensive positions. The jungle was stripped bare, trees reduced to splintered stumps. The smell of smoke and burning fuel carried far out to sea. The battleships continued to fire in a carefully planned sequence. Each salvo was calculated to prevent any surviving defenders from regrouping. Every shot had a purpose, every target marked in advance. It was a display of precision and overwhelming force. As the final shells fell, the beaches fell silent except for the crackle of small fires. The Japanese defense had been shattered. The bombardment had not just destroyed fortifications, it had erased the very structure of command. The way was now clear for the landing forces waiting offshore, and the first phase of the battle for Leyte was complete. The first shells fell without warning. In the darkness before dawn, Japanese soldiers waited in bunkers and trenches along the coast of Leyte, whispering quietly or sitting in silence. Most believed they were ready. They had heard rumors of an American invasion, and they trusted the fortifications they had built. Their guns were hidden under camouflage, their positions carefully planned. When the bombardment began, it was unlike anything they had imagined. A deep, rolling sound came first, like distant thunder. Then the earth shook violently. Some men thought it was an earthquake, a rare event in this part of the islands. The next moment, the sky lit up with flashes of fire. Massive explosions tore apart the jungle and beaches. The ground buckled under the force. One soldier later said it felt as if the island itself had turned to liquid. The range of the attack stunned them. The ships were nowhere in sight, far beyond the horizon. Yet their shells arrived with terrifying accuracy. Japanese spotters scrambled to find the source. They climbed observation towers and scanned the sea through field glasses, but there was only haze and smoke. The shells seemed to come from the sky itself. Men clutched their rifles and looked upward as the whistling sound of incoming fire filled the air. In the moments before impact, they could hear nothing else. Some prayed, some shouted, others sat frozen in disbelief. When the shells landed, everything disappeared in clouds of dust and flame. Bunkers collapsed. Trenches vanished. Entire squads were gone in an instant. In one section of the defense line, Corporal Hideo Sato crouched inside a concrete shelter with 7 other men. He had been awake since midnight, waiting for word from his commander. The first explosion threw him against the wall, knocking the breath from his lungs. Dust filled the bunker, choking and blinding the men inside. Sato shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of continuous shelling. He felt the ground tremble beneath him. Pieces of concrete fell from the ceiling. One soldier tried to escape through the entrance, but another blast collapsed the doorway, sealing them inside. They were trapped in darkness, coughing and gasping for air. When the shelling shifted slightly inland, Sato and 2 others dug frantically with their hands until they managed to clear the blocked entrance. What they saw outside did not look like the same beach they had defended the day before. Trees were splintered and burned. The sand was churned into craters the size of houses. Bodies lay scattered among shattered weapons and equipment. Sato stared in shock. The positions they had spent months building were gone. He could hear wounded men crying out, but the voices were scattered and fading. Smoke burned his eyes. Above him, more shells screamed overhead toward inland targets. Some survivors believed the Americans had created a new type of weapon, something beyond ordinary artillery. They whispered about giant guns and flying bombs. No one could understand how such destruction could be delivered from so far away. From the perspective of the American battleship crews, the scene was different but no less intense. Aboard the Iowa, the gun crews worked steadily inside their turrets. They felt the ship shake each time a round was fired. The heat and noise inside the enclosed space were almost unbearable. Through periscopes and observation decks, sailors watched the shoreline erupt. They saw their shells strike with precision, tearing apart enemy defenses. The sight filled many with awe. These were the same guns they had trained with for months, but seeing them used in combat on this scale was humbling. There was no cheering. The men understood the gravity of what they were doing. Each salvo meant destruction and death. The focus remained on the mission, to clear the way for the Marines and soldiers who would soon storm the beaches. On the decks of the landing craft, those troops saw the bombardment from another angle. Packed tightly in small boats, they stared at the rising columns of smoke and fire. The noise was deafening, even miles from shore. Some men felt relief, knowing that the Japanese positions were being hammered before they had to face them. Others felt fear. They wondered what kind of enemy could survive such a pounding and what awaited them once they landed. Private James Hanley, a Marine rifleman, gripped his weapon as his boat moved toward the beach. He had grown up near a steel mill and thought he understood loud machinery, but the roar of the naval guns was beyond anything he had ever heard. The explosions on shore reminded him of volcanoes he had seen in newsreels. Part of him felt safe, shielded by the firepower of the battleships. Another part of him worried that nothing could completely destroy a determined enemy. As the landing craft drew closer, Hanley could see flashes of movement through the smoke. Here and there, Japanese defenders were still firing from the ruins. The destruction was total, yet the fight was not over. Back on the beach, Sato stumbled through the wreckage. He had lost his helmet and most of his equipment. His uniform was torn, and his hands were raw from digging. Around him, a handful of other soldiers wandered in a daze. They had no clear orders and no functioning radios. When they saw the approaching landing craft, some tried to raise their rifles. Others fled into the jungle. Sato dropped behind a fallen tree and fired a few rounds, more out of instinct than strategy. The noise of the bombardment had faded, replaced by the rattle of small arms and the distant roar of engines. He knew they could not hold the beach. Their command structure was gone, their defenses shattered. For the Japanese defenders, the experience was one of complete shock. The power of the American guns was beyond anything they had faced before. The destruction was so sudden and total that many could not comprehend it. For the Americans, it was a demonstration of overwhelming force, a grim reminder of the cost of war. As the two sides prepared to meet face to face, the memories of that bombardment would stay with them forever. The final shells fell silent, leaving only the crackle of fires and the sound of waves against the ruined shoreline. Smoke hung over the beaches, drifting inland on the morning breeze. In the distance, American landing craft moved steadily toward shore. The bombardment had lasted for hours, and its effect was clear. The Japanese coastal defenses, once strong and carefully planned, were now broken. Before the first American soldier set foot on Leyte, much of the Japanese defense network was already gone. The massive 16-inch guns of the Iowa, New Jersey, and Wisconsin had crushed artillery positions, destroyed bunkers, and buried defensive trenches under tons of earth. Command posts were silent. Radio towers were flattened. Ammunition depots had gone up in flames, leaving only blackened craters. The initial landings faced scattered resistance rather than the coordinated fire the Japanese had prepared. Where there should have been overlapping fields of machine gun fire, there was only silence or sporadic shots from isolated defenders. Marines and soldiers stepped off their landing craft into beaches that were still dangerous but not the death traps the Japanese had intended. The speed of the advance surprised even the Americans. Beachheads were secured faster than planners had predicted. Units pushed inland within hours instead of days. This success was not accidental. The bombardment had been planned with precision. Reconnaissance planes and submarines had mapped every visible bunker and gun position before the first shell was fired. Forward observers corrected the fire in real time, ensuring that no key target was left standing. The result was a demonstration of naval power at its most effective. Japanese commanders had counted on their coastal artillery to delay the American landings. They believed that strong defenses and determined troops could inflict heavy casualties and buy time for reinforcements. These strategies had worked on smaller islands earlier in the war. At places like Tarawa and Peleliu, American forces had faced brutal resistance from well-prepared defenders. At Leyte, those tactics failed. The scale of the American bombardment was far beyond anything the Japanese had seen before. Their coastal guns, hidden in caves and bunkers, were destroyed before they could fire more than a few rounds. Defensive positions meant to last for weeks were gone in minutes. Even strong points that survived the initial strikes were cut off from communication and supplies. The men inside were left to fight on their own or retreat into the jungle. The battle proved that traditional Japanese defensive methods were no longer enough. The U.S. Navy had shown that it could dominate not just the sea but the land near the coast. With battleships delivering heavy, accurate fire, no shoreline fortification was safe. The old idea of meeting an enemy at the water's edge had become obsolete. The psychological effect was just as important as the physical destruction. Japanese morale suffered a deep and lasting blow. Soldiers who survived the bombardment were shaken by the experience. Many had never even seen the American ships that attacked them. The shells came from beyond the horizon, leaving defenders feeling helpless and exposed. In interviews and reports captured later in the war, Japanese soldiers described the bombardment as unnatural, almost otherworldly. Some believed the Americans had built a new kind of weapon. Others thought they were fighting a force that could not be defeated by ordinary means. This sense of dread spread quickly through the ranks. For the Americans, the effect was the opposite. The success at Leyte gave them a reputation for unstoppable power. Marines and soldiers who landed on the beaches gained confidence from knowing that the enemy had been devastated before they arrived. Naval crews took pride in their role, though they also understood the weight of what they had done. The broader strategic picture shifted as well. By neutralizing the Japanese defenses so completely, the U.S. gained a foothold in the Philippines faster than expected. This allowed them to bring in more troops, supplies, and equipment without heavy losses. Control of Leyte opened the way to retake the rest of the islands and cut off Japanese forces in the region. The Japanese Navy, already stretched thin, faced a grim reality. Their ships could not come close enough to challenge the American battleships without risking destruction. Their remaining carriers lacked experienced pilots. With no way to match the bombardment, they were forced into desperate measures, including the use of kamikaze attacks for the first time on a large scale. Even among Japanese leaders, the message was clear. The old balance of power at sea was gone. Before Leyte, there had been hope that a well-prepared defense and a decisive naval battle could slow the American advance. After the bombardment, that hope faded. The scale and precision of American naval gunfire showed that even the strongest fortifications were temporary obstacles. On the ground, the consequences were visible in every ruined bunker and abandoned trench. Survivors of the Japanese garrison retreated into the interior of the island, where they fought in smaller, scattered groups. Without coordination, their resistance was limited. American forces could now focus on pushing inland instead of fighting for control of the beaches. The tempo of the war changed after Leyte. With the Japanese coastal defenses shattered, amphibious operations became faster and more efficient. American commanders grew more confident in their ability to land forces anywhere they chose. The battleships proved they could create an opening for an invasion almost at will. For the Japanese soldier who had crouched in a bunker during the first moments of the bombardment, the experience left a lasting scar. He had survived the physical destruction, but he could not forget the feeling of helplessness as the sky rained fire. For his commanders, the lesson was equally clear. Their old strategies had been erased in a single day of overwhelming firepower. The sight of American landing craft moving unopposed onto the beaches was more than a tactical defeat. It marked a turning point in the war. From that moment forward, the Japanese knew that the Americans had not only the will to fight but also the means to strike anywhere, anytime, with a force no defense could withstand. When the guns fell silent at Leyte, the wreckage of the Japanese defenses was clear. The bombardment had proven the worth of the American battleships beyond any doubt. Their 16-inch guns had not only destroyed enemy positions, but had shaped the course of the battle before the first soldier stepped onto the beach. For a moment, it seemed that battleships were once again the kings of the sea. But the war was changing, and their role would change with it. In the months that followed, aircraft carriers continued to grow in importance. Carrier-based planes could strike targets hundreds of miles away, well beyond the reach of even the largest naval guns. As the war progressed, carriers became the centerpiece of the fleet, while battleships shifted into supporting roles. Their big guns were still valuable for shore bombardment, but they no longer decided the outcome of naval engagements. The 16-inch guns remained symbols of American naval engineering. Each barrel was a feat of precision and strength, designed to deliver devastating fire with accuracy. The sight of a battleship firing a full broadside left a lasting impression on anyone who witnessed it. Even as carriers took center stage, the battleships carried a certain weight and presence that no other vessel could match. The experience at Leyte cemented the importance of battleships in amphibious operations during World War II. Their ability to break open fortified beaches allowed the Marines and Army to land with fewer losses and greater speed. In the Pacific, where so many battles were fought over islands with entrenched defenders, this capability was essential. Without the firepower of ships like the Iowa and Wisconsin, assaults on places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa would have been even more costly. These lessons influenced naval tactics after the war. Designers recognized the need for ships that could support landings while also defending against air and submarine threats. This thinking shaped the next generation of warships, which combined heavy guns with missiles, radar, and advanced anti-aircraft weapons. However, as technology advanced, the big guns began to fade. By the 1950s and 60s, guided missiles had taken over many of the roles once filled by naval artillery. Missiles could strike targets farther away with greater precision. Aircraft continued to expand their reach, carrying bombs and torpedoes deep into enemy territory. Battleships were no longer the decisive factor they had been at Leyte. Many of the great battleships were retired or scrapped. Their steel was recycled, their names remembered in history books and veteran stories. A few survived as museum ships, preserved to show future generations what naval warfare once looked like. The USS Iowa and USS Wisconsin are among those preserved ships. Today, they rest in quiet harbors, open to the public. Visitors can walk the decks where sailors once worked under wartime conditions. They can look up at the massive 16-inch guns, still pointing outward as if ready to fire again. These ships stand as physical reminders of an era when battleships were the symbols of national power. Standing beside one of those giant turrets, it is easy to understand the shock felt by Japanese forces during the bombardment at Leyte. The scale of the weapon is staggering. The barrels are long and heavy, each one capable of firing a shell across miles of ocean or deep inland. When 9 of them fired together, the effect was overwhelming. For soldiers on the receiving end, it must have seemed unstoppable. The psychological impact of the Leyte bombardment foreshadowed events yet to come. In the final year of the war, Japan would face weapons of even greater power. When atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the sense of helplessness was similar to what the defenders of Leyte had felt. In both cases, the enemy delivered destruction from beyond sight with no chance to fight back. For the Americans, the bombardment was a demonstration of industrial and military strength. It showed that their fleet could project power on a scale unmatched by any other nation. The lessons learned at Leyte carried into the Cold War, influencing strategies for projecting force around the world. Even as battleships disappeared from active service, their legacy shaped how the Navy thought about firepower and control of the seas. Some of the final uses of 16-inch guns came decades later, during conflicts like the Korean War and the Gulf War. Even then, they were valued for their ability to deliver massive fire support in a short period of time. But these were exceptions, not the rule. By the end of the 20th century, no new battleships were built. The age of the carrier and the missile had fully arrived. Yet the memory of the great guns remains. Veterans who served aboard the Iowa and Wisconsin speak of the skill and teamwork required to operate them. Historians study their role in battles like Leyte to understand how warfare evolved during the mid-20th century. Tourists stand in silence when they see the size of the guns, imagining the thunder of a full broadside. The bombardment at Leyte was a turning point. It marked the peak of battleship power and the beginning of their decline. The 16-inch gun had proven its worth, but it also showed the limits of traditional naval warfare in an age of rapid technological change. When visitors walk the decks of the preserved battleships today, they stand in the shadow of history. The cold steel of the guns, the worn decking underfoot, and the view across the harbor connect them to a moment when these ships were at the center of a global conflict. The legacy of those guns is not only in the battles they fought but also in the lessons they left behind, lessons that continue to shape navies and nations to this day.